All right. Well, thank you for joining me for this very, very last session on reducing harmful online behaviours in tertiary settings. And as I was preparing the talk, I actually realised I probably bit off a little bit more than I could chew, because our research alone focuses on behaviours such as cyberbullying, cyber dating abuse, sexual exploitation. So I thought I should actually also, taking into consideration that this is the last session of the day, I thought I should focus on something fun. So I'm going to talk about sexting. So when we talk about sexting, the language around sexting depends obviously on who talks about sexting. Young people don't use the term sexting. They talk about nudes, they talk about sexy selfies. The eSafety Commissioner, for example, uses the term intimate images. But I think we all kind of know what we're talking about, right? Well, when we talk about sexting, what actually is the definition? So sexting can be defined as the sending, receiving, or forwarding of sexually explicit messages, images, or photos to others through electronic means, primarily between cellular phones. Now, one of the things that's important here is that it actually incorporates three behaviours: the sending, the receiving, and the forwarding or the dissemination of these images. And I'm actually going to get to that on the next slide. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. What we do know, and also, heads up, there's going to be more information about that, it's relatively common among young people, and it has actually been considered such a major issue that there was actually an inquiry into sexting by the Law Reform Committee in 2013. So that's 9 years ago. So 9 years ago already, this was considered a relatively big issue. All right, so coming back to this definition, and it's important. So when we look at sexting, we have the receiving, the sending, and the dissemination or sharing. And one of the things that's important is that each one of these behaviors can be consensual or non-consensual. So if we go into the actual behaviors here, so if we look at sexting, we receive an image that is wanted. Young people, as I said, frequently engage in this behavior. But what happens when it's non-consensual? And obviously, I have my little stars here. People often refer to D-pics. People have been sent, a D-pic, etc. So that's the non-consensual receiving. Someone sends you an image that you did not want to receive, right? Okay, so the sending also can be consensual or non-consensual. Sending often happens, for example, one of the most frequent reasons why people send and receive is because they want to establish sexual relationships, right? Something that's quite frequent, obviously across all age groups, but particularly in students as well, right? So they engage in this quite frequently. The sending consensual, but it can also be non-consensual. So for example, if people are being hassled or they're being pressured, to come on, send me one, etc. Now, the disseminating is where things get really, really tricky, because we have both the victimization and the perpetration. And it only so occurred that we actually had a student, when we were talking about the dissemination, where we had a student in our research group and said, yeah, I let my boyfriend disseminate these. And we went, oh? And it's the first time it actually occurred to us that there could be, because in the language, often when we talk about dissemination of sex, often it's referred to as revenge porn. Yeah? So we hear in the media, it's always coined as, revenge porn, etc. But what we learned from this is that it can actually be consensual as well. So this student of ours actually said, oh yes, I tell my boyfriend who he can share these images with. So that's actually consensual dissemination. So in terms of, I know it's under the victimization, but it can be consensual or non-consensual. However, it can also be non-consensual when these images are shared, for example, on things such as slut pages. The perpetration, again, sometimes people ask, can I disseminate or share this picture with others? So that then is obviously consensual or non-consensual, and there are many. These are generally the sort of examples that are shared in the media. This is one from a little while ago for those of you who are from Victoria or into AFL, when the Richmond Football Club won the premiership. There was an image of a young woman with the premiership medal between her breasts that was widely disseminated, for example. It was touted as revenge porn. I cringed. It's not revenge porn. It's non-consensual dissemination. Yeah? So these are all of the behaviors. Now, why is that important? Why do I keep talking about this? Well, first of all, let's have a look actually at how often this happens. So In 2014, we wrote the first systematic review on sexting behaviours. And one of the things that you can see here is that when we've been doing a lot of research since then, so for example, in terms of sending, in 2014 that rate was 48.6%. It's now between 65 to 73%, so it's increased substantially. In terms of receiving, it used to be 56%. We now have rates of 81.8 to 86.6%. So if you think of a student cohort, it's almost all of your students will at some stage have received a nude. Yeah? So receiving unwanted, and I've actually split this up here because what we see quite substantially is a very, very large gender effect whereby about a quarter of men have received unwanted nudes. In 2019, it was 48.3 for women, so twice as much for the women. In our latest research of 2021, it was 77.4%. So more than 3/4 of young women have received an unwanted nude. And it's 3 times as many as the men. Now, in regards to dissemination perpetration, we found rates between 10%, so these are people who've disseminated images they have received, and the rates have varied from 10.1 to 18.6%. Once we realized that some people do give their consent as well to have their images disseminated, we looked at that, and which was 8.4% overall. However, when you look at this, it was 70.7% of men and only 3.4% of women. So huge gender effects there in terms of who actually gives consent to their images to be shared with as well. Now, why does all of this matter? Because obviously we're in a session with a link for mental health and well-being. Well, why do we care? So the first issue is that, first of all, are the legal consequences. So I think all but one states now have got laws in regards to the non-consensual sharing of intimate images, whereby it has been made an illegal behaviour. In Victoria, the non-consensual sharing of intimate images is punishable with a level 7 imprisonment, which is up to 2 years. And even the threat to disseminate such images has a level 8 imprisonment, which is 1 year maximum. So even just the threat to share. So there are social consequences, cyberbullying, having a ruined reputation, associated with also with a greater number of suicides, so impact on mental health. May also hinder job prospects. A lot of students will eventually go trying to find a job. 95% of all employers will check their social profile. So it can actually be very detrimental to then, find something online. In terms of emotional consequences, so people have reported shame, guilt, greater levels of depression after sexting. People are also more likely to have contemplated suicide afterwards, and it has been shown to be harmful to children's development, particularly when engaged in very, very early. Now, the question you're probably asking yourself now is, so does this mean that all sexting is bad, right? So a lot of people are engaging it, so is all of it bad? Well, the question is actually, when is it bad? And we actually looked at this in a study in 2019, where we looked at what is the role of consent. So if we talk about sexting and have, consensual versus non-consensual, what are actually the implications of consent in this context? So as you can see here, in terms of what was interesting, in terms of the non-consensual behaviors here, so in having received unwanted sex, the women in this study were twice as likely to have received. However, having sent sex under coercion, there was no gender difference. So when we then looked at this in terms of its relationship with mental health, there was absolutely no relationship between consensual sexting and mental health. So mental health was measured by the DASS, which is depression, anxiety, and stress, and we also looked at self-esteem. There was no relationship between the two. However, there were effects, and significant effects, when we looked at non-consensual sexting and mental health. So for both receiving unwanted and sex under coercion were independent predictors for depression, anxiety, and stress as they increased, and self-esteem as it was significantly lower. Interestingly, so also there was an interaction with gender because those receiving unwanted sex was more strongly related to psychological distress for men than women. So really, really interesting finding there as well, particularly taking into consideration women now receive 3 times as many as men. So there might be some interesting explanations for that. Now, the other thing that obviously, when we think about the sharing of these intimate images, is to look at why is it that people engage in these behaviors. So it's an illegal behavior now, but why do we actually engage in it? So our research has shown very, very strongly that the number one reason why men share these sexts is because the person was hot. That's a shocker, right? Yes, I know. They also share, but to a lesser degree. I did not think it was a big deal. They also show it to brag, to get attention, and to improve their social status. It looks very different when you look at why women actually share. So the number one reason is actually as a joke or to be funny. So they also share because the person was hot. They did not think it was a big deal. But also, interestingly enough, if you look at roasting, they share, 15% of women share to roast somebody. And the most interesting one as well, if you look at the third last, to demonstrate harassment. Not a single male shared an image to demonstrate harassment, but nearly 10% of women did. So this is often when a woman gets sent an unwanted nude and then forwards it on to show, well, look what I got. So this is to demonstrate the sort of harassment. So what then happens when someone gets an unwanted nude? Good question. Okay, for men, the number one response is praise. So 60% of men, where after they share a sext, receive praise. Or they receive no response, or they get sent an image in return. Women, on the other hand, also receive praise, however, significantly less so. They receive laughter, significantly more so than men. So women, so a third of women who share one, receive laughter as a response. And so what you can see here is, and in terms of being sent an image in return, men are significantly more likely to do so. So you can see the very different responses also in terms of what happens. All right, so this is actually just a sort of summary slide, so I might actually skip through this a little bit. But I think the most important things out of this is that we always assume, or often the sharing of sex has been, really conceptualized as revenge porn. And if you look at those motivations and responses, it's not. It's a lot more innocuous, at least for why people do it and how they respond to it, right? So what does all of this mean for the higher education sector? So, and one of the things I actually want to come back to, because it was mentioned a fair bit across all of those sessions today, was language. So when when we talk about, the sharing, people talk about revenge porn. It's not actually the right term. So the reason why people, share it and how people respond to it has very rarely anything to do with revenge. So and some of my recommendations here have also been talked about and discussed before. So the first one, obviously, we need evidence to inform our practice and interventions. Our evidence clearly shows that the majority of sex dissemination is not revenge porn, and it's really a misnomer. So please help me in actually trying to change the language for this, because it's not all revenge porn. Our prevention efforts need to provide information to let students know that while we know that the motivations are largely innocuous, it is still harmful and illegal. We know from those who are victim survivors of this behavior that it has quite substantial consequences for the victims. So our education needs to focus on consent in both online and offline interactions. So what we do know in terms of the online space, and particularly at university, so that currently there is a lack of information in regards to these online interactions. We need more information for both accidental perpetration and victimization of these behaviors. Education needs to focus on consent, and particularly how consent is established online. So how do young people negotiate online consent? We've just done some research, hot off the press, where we asked young people, how did you negotiate consent? And apparently more than a quarter of young men had received consent to disseminate. So we said, well, how did you negotiate that consent? And the responses were, oh, she was drunk and she said it was okay. So potentially how we establish consent online is something that we might still have to work on a little bit. We need better responses for our victims. Our messages need to move beyond, shaming victims and telling them what not to do. And we have to focus also on a whole of community response, which has been mentioned by many people here today, and promote respectful interactions. And last but not least, we were very, very lucky because Deakin University, where I am, was selected as one of the first 2 pilot universities in Victoria to roll out SAW, which was in conjunction with Universities Australia. And the eSafety Commissioner. SAW stands for Safer Online Awareness Resilience. So the implementation involved key stakeholders across the university, including academic and professionals. So what we did in 2022 has pretty much been, we focused on small wins with 3 key priorities: staff awareness, student awareness, and ensuring that all digital tools, programs, and services were aligned with eSafety. So, for example, for student awareness, some of our own research has shown that very few students are aware of eSafety, so it's now been added to the unit guides. So it was a really, really small sort of step to take, but with, potentially very far-reaching, hopefully positive consequences, whereby we're making students actually aware of the eSafety Commissioner, and that's now included in all of the unit guides. So the online harm information was added to students in those unit guides. There was an incorporation of eSafety Women in the Spotlight, information into the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion faculty task forces, and then also the addition of online harm scenarios and hypothetical cases as part of the training programs for staff and students. And for the second half of this year works underway to ensure Deakin has an incident database relating to online harm, so that we have baseline data and can look at what's going on, and student as well as student-led eSafety campaigns, and I think we're actually going to focus on that in the new year as well as the incorporation of eSafety information into staff induction processes. And if you would like to hear more about all of this, we actually did a little podcast about this as well. So we have a little link there to a podcast where we've discussed all of these various initiatives as well as our research that we have been doing at Deakin. And thank you very much for listening. I know that it's late and I really appreciate it. And if you have any other questions or would like any of those papers sent to you, I would be more than thrilled to do so. Thank you very much.